This is tricky. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. This is tricky. Tricky disco. 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 Tricky disco. 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 Tricky disco. 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 Tricky disco. 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 Tricky disco, disco, disco. Tricky disco, disco, disco. Tricky disco, 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 disco. This is tricky. This is the tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco. 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 This is tricky disco. 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 This is tricky disco. 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 This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky.
This Potronic.
Application error. The application has run out of memory. Now the system starts to reboot. Tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco. Disco. This is tricky disco. Disco. Tricky disco. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. Tricky disco. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. This is tricky. Disco.
This is Potronic.
Tricky disco. Tricky disco. Tricky disco. Tricky disco.
is in custody. Slow down, cover.